people have never known a world without giraffe. We've evolved on the landscape as a species with giraffe since our beginnings. And so giraffe have incredible cultural value. You can go back to rock carvings and petroglyphs thousands of years old, and people have always been fascinated with these animals, and it's something core to our existence as a species. We've never known a world without giraffe, and so there's an incredible iconic status of these animals.
Welcome to the Possibilists. The Possibilists is a podcast collaboration between the Smithsonian Earth Optimism and Pelecanus. The Smithsonian Conservation Commons Earth Optimism initiative is changing the conservation narrative from one that focuses on problems and perils to highlighting impactful solutions. By celebrating what's working in conservation, they seek to inspire action and move global community from a sense of loss to one of hope and finding solutions to save our planet. Pelecanus is a conservation-based collective in continuous wonder of the healing and encouragement that is possible on this planet and the people making it happen. We are committed to telling these stories and demonstrating optimism through science. Now, in this partnership, we spotlight conservationists working with a possibilistic attitude for solution-based efforts to tackle the world's critical environmental struggles. We're attempting to reframe the narrative around conservation to show that conservation successes are possible through changes in attitude and implementation of intentional change. In this episode, we talk with Arthur Muneza and Michael Brown of the Giraffe Conservation Foundation. Arthur is GCF's East Africa coordinator, where he manages research for 3 species of giraffe in East Africa, and Michael is a joint fellow with GCF in the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, where he works to advance GCF's mission of informing conservation initiatives with the most rigorous science available. GCF aims to raise awareness and support towards securing a future for giraffes and the conservation of their habitat in Africa, and more specifically to support conservation of viable and existing habitat for giraffes, identify key threats to giraffes in Africa, and develop innovative ways to mitigate them, as well as plan, develop, implement, and administer projects in cooperation with local communities and partner institutions, collaborate with local, national, and international partners on giraffe conservation efforts in the interest of giraffe conservation in African range states, and also raise funds for giraffe conservation and management throughout Africa. These two and GCF in general do so much, so let's get straight to our conversation with Arthur and Michael. Let's talk about some giraffes. Thank you so much for joining us, Arthur and Michael. If you don't mind, just to get started here, do you mind introducing yourself and what you do for GCF? I guess we'll start with you, Arthur.
Thanks, Austin. So my name is Arthur Muneza. I'm the East African coordinator for the Giraffe Conservation Foundation. And what that basically means is I work with the different partners in East Africa to implement giraffe conservation initiatives. So these partners range from field researchers, vets, government partners, private stakeholders, just anybody who's interested in implementing giraffe conservation initiatives, just to make sure that we are raising awareness and getting people excited about conserving giraffes.
I'm Michael Brown. I'm a conservation science fellow with the Giraffe Conservation Foundation and the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute. And so what I do with these organizations is try to design, implement, execute, and communicate effective scientific studies for informing the conservation of giraffe throughout the range. And that involves bringing together diverse perspectives on thinking and doing in the conservation sciences and trying to adapt those different techniques and different perspectives to the conditions we see on the ground throughout the various range states we work, to make sure that we're using the best available science and trying to collect the best available information to understand the ecology of these systems, understand the interactions with the people, and then monitor conservation initiatives so that we know what we're doing for giraffe conservation is actually effective.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so my first real question that I want to go to is, what is a giraffe conservation initiative? What does that actually mean? But now that I'm thinking about it, I was like, we should probably describe the species so everyone understands what we're talking about. So if I'm correct, there's one type of giraffe, but there's 9 subspecies.
You've just breached right off the bat a pretty pressing topic in the giraffe conservation field at the moment. So giraffe taxonomy is sort of in a phase of evolution if you'll forgive the double entendre there, the historical perspective, at least the one that was adopted by the IUCN Red List, which is sort of the conservation assessment body, is that there was one species of giraffe with 9 subspecies. But emerging data using a host of different techniques is sort of changing the perspectives that we have on giraffe taxonomy. And instead of one species with 9 subspecies, there may indeed be 4 separate species, each with various subspecies beneath them. So work with the Giraffe Conservation Foundation, spearheaded by the Giraffe Conservation Foundation, using genomic level genetic studies has shown that, oh my goodness, there might actually be 4 subspecies, which obviously would change our perspectives on giraffe conservation. And instead of looking at it as one species and doing the assessment as a species level, if you break it down into 4 separate species, the narrative changes considerably for each one of these constituent species. So taxonomy in and of itself is a tricky business. Trying to sort of bin these very fluid, diverse systems into, discrete units that make sense to us as people is an inherently challenging thing to do. And it's not necessarily how nature operates, but it is useful and effective in conservation and helping to target and define different conservation initiatives, which we'll define later, hopefully. So to make a short question, to provide a long answer to a short question, it's a little more complicated, and there might actually be 4 species, and the evidence is strongly suggesting that.
That also makes it more difficult when you're trying to, like you said, trying to take that to the communities and say, hey, this is why, all the giraffe conservation initiatives. It's like if you're saying, hey, we know we have this, and people are like, wait, I thought there was one species of giraffe, and it just it's so confusing for us. I mean, at least for me, it's already so confusing because I took genetics classes and I'm just I barely got through it. And so if someone who has no idea about conservation, they get to this genomics level, concepts. How do you try to get around that?
Well, to answer that question, I think it's a very important one. Simply because if you look at where these different giraffe species are distributed across Africa, you'd see immediately that actually they face different threat levels, and also they require different levels of conservation attention. And so if we all think of the giraffe population of Africa as one species, then we definitely not see the uniqueness of the uniqueness and maybe also the urgency of the conservation attention that's needed. So if I can quickly give an example of, for instance, the reticulated giraffe, from the data that we have, we can now see that it's a unique species on its own. And this is a species that occurs mainly in semi-arid areas, and also requires, and also is mainly occurs in community lands. So this one requires much broader levels of partnerships with the community members, with governments, simply because of the threat levels that it faces. It's now listed as endangered at the species level, and that is really key to just show the urgency needed to protect it. And so it sort of gives the government and the stakeholders more impetus to get involved, as opposed to thinking of it as a subspecies.
Yeah, and to build on that topic, so if we look at the current assessment of giraffe under IUCN as a species, as one species, they're categorized as vulnerable, right? But as Arthur just mentioned, when you break it down into these separate species that have been identified by some of these studies since, it adds some nuance to that. So Arthur gave a great example, the reticulated giraffe. You can look at the northern giraffe that are critically endangered. And so giraffe are widespread throughout over 20 different countries. And obviously, if you try to cast a big narrative over the whole continent of Africa, it's going to muddle out some of the nuance in some of the conservation initiatives. So we can look at the reticulated giraffe and the northern giraffe and see, endangered, critically endangered. But conversely, if you go down into southern Africa and look at some of these species, the southern species, some of the populations are actually increasing. And so the whole threat level and the whole population trajectory cast over an entire continent really doesn't tell the whole story of giraffe conservation. It doesn't offer the narrative and the nuance necessary to effectively communicate the diversity of threats and the diversity of opportunities that we have for giraffe conservation throughout their entire range.
So my next thought was like, we should probably take a step back and just kind of talk about giraffes and, you know, what they are. But I was thinking about that. I was like, I don't know if anyone really needs us to describe giraffes. I feel like everyone knows what a giraffe is just because they are such a weird looking species. I mean, to not have a better word.
Well, some of the things that people don't recognize about giraffes is how widely distributed they are and the diversity of habitats that you can find them in. So I just mentioned giraffes are found in over 20 different countries throughout Africa. And this ranges from some incredibly diverse landscapes. You've got these hyper-arid deserts in northwest Namibia that look almost like a Martian landscape. It's incredible. And then you can go to some of these more mesic savannas on the banks of the Nile in Uganda, where you actually see giraffe kind of like weaving through woodland and trying to weave through, you know, these closed canopy Acacia boreana woodlands. And they run the gamut. So there's just a big arc. Pretty much everything sub-Saharan around the Congo rainforest, giraffe historically were found. And now the populations are a bit more patchy, just given the increasing development. But you still find giraffe in an incredible diversity of landscapes. And they do surprisingly well in this remarkable, you know, Martian to woodland type of landscape. And so it's a really, really cool system to study because they are so large and you think they'd be highly specialized, but they live in these incredibly diverse landscapes and they're just amazing creatures.
Arthur, if you, as the East Africa coordinator, that sounds like a logistical nightmare to me. How do you conserve giraffes in 20 different countries that all have different habitats? And so I guess we could start with, like, you know, my original question was, what does a giraffe conservation initiative look like?
I mean, one thing that we can also add into that whole gumbo pot of issues that we face here is that each African country has its own system of management. So I'll focus on East Africa just to show how there are different, how different systems work and how we come in. I mean, which is super exciting as well. I mean, I love my job. I mean, as the East African coordinator, I get to work with different stakeholders. So what we call an initiative, at least within GCF, is we try to see within these different populations across East Africa, what do we want to do and who can we work with? So at GCF, I mean, we consider ourselves a small NGO, but with a big footprint. And the best way to do that is to identify the right partner. So we start off by looking at, for instance, in Eastern Africa, most wildlife population, most conservation areas are managed by governments. So you have to start working with governments. And so what do governments need? In some instances, we work with government institutions, maybe to equip rangers, or maybe we work with governments to identify high-level strategic frameworks that identify priorities for giraffe conservation. And so this is key for essentially getting people together to share ideas, to share knowledge, and essentially chart a way forward for giraffe conservation. One of the key successes that we've had is working with governments and other stakeholders to develop national strategies for giraffe conservation. This has been really successful in Niger. So Niger is a country in West Africa. It's one of the, if you look at the GDP, it's ranked as one of the poorest countries in Africa, but also one of the most forward-thinking countries in terms of giraffe conservation. They have the last West African giraffe population in the world. There are none in zoos. And this population in the last 30 years has been extinct in at least 5 West African countries. I could be wrong, but I think that's the number. So in the last 30 years. And so they've managed to conserve the last West African giraffe population by bringing in communities and also NGOs to essentially grow the population in human villages. So this is a population that until maybe 2 years ago didn't occur in a protected area. So it was protected by communities, but the government came in and worked with us and also different communities and NGOs to protect the population. And since then it has grown. And we worked with the government there 2 years ago to translocate some individuals to now their, I would say, premier national park, an area called Gadabeji. And just expanding the range of this population was really, really something big, because for some of the government officials and also for some of the vets, it was their first time ever translocating animals. And so that's something that we would call an initiative where it builds up from a national strategy brings together different stakeholders to implement actions for protecting giraffe. And so you'd find that these different actions are linked in a way where you have community engagement, you have welfare issues, and you have expanding the range of animals which bring into ecology. And so it's really this sort of big machine that needs a lot of people putting in ideas and putting in time and resources to make a successful program for giraffe conservation. And so at the core of it all, to bring everything together, that's really the key goal of GCF, to essentially secure sustainable populations, to secure a sustainable future for giraffe populations in the wild.
You know, you bringing up partnerships, I think is really interesting, because it's something that we talk about a lot in all of our podcasts that we've done. It's just a theme that just kind of goes through every single topic we've talked about, is partnerships and how organizations come together. Because I find it so interesting, because one of the ideas of this organization we have is to show that there's people. The good news is that there's people like you guys doing this. And then when you unpack that, hey, there's these people that are like literally dedicating their lives to save condors, giraffes, climate change research, intertidal, whatever it is. And then once you like open that up, you start to see like, oh, they have 10 partners on this project, and that partner has 10 partners on a different project. And it's just like this weird like web around the world. And it's just so incredible. And it's just, that's what gives me hope. It's like, oh, there's so many people working on this.
I mean, sure. Partnerships are really key to getting conservation right, I'd say that. I mean, so here, for instance, in Kenya, I can't do any conservation research work without involving the Kenya Wildlife Service. They cover the government-managed conservation areas. And so if I want to go beyond that, then I'd need to work with the county governments as well. So for instance, we've had instances where we've had to tag giraffe in, say, Samburu National Reserve. This is a county government managed conservation area. So you need to then build partnerships and networks and relationships with the people on the ground to do such work. One of our big initiatives is known as Twiga Wetu. And this is a program that involves so Twiga is Swahili for giraffe, Wetu is our giraffe. That's the initiative, Twiga Wetu. And this is a community-driven initiative where we work with community members to collect data on giraffe. It might be on environmental education, or it might be just basically monitoring giraffes, seeing where they are and reporting cases of mortality, such cases. And that project, we got that project off the ground with the San Diego Wildlife Alliance, who hired community scouts or community guards. In Swahili, they are known as Twiga Walinzi, to basically monitor the giraffe in northern Kenya. And that's really key, because these areas, as I mentioned earlier, are areas where giraffe occur in community lands. And so you need a community presence, somebody from within that area to work with the people there to monitor giraffes, see where they are, just basically do the basic science that we can use, and then to extract data to have a good understanding of the ecology of these different populations. The other one, we also have initiatives where we work with different vets, might be vets that are private vets, or maybe government vets, to monitor giraffe health or study giraffe skin disease, which is also another interesting topic. And so that just highlights the wide range of partners that I've worked with, and maybe Michael has different partners that he's worked with that he would like to highlight.
Yeah, thanks. The root of conservation is collaboration and developing trust and relationships, because at the end of the day, a lot of the conservation solutions to some of these problems that we identified are people-driven, and developing these networks of partners bring together diverse perspectives and diverse ways of acting. And that's crucial for the success of any initiative. And so developing this trust with the relationship with people on the ground, developing value with organizations like the Kenya Wildlife Service or Uganda Wildlife Authority is really important, because you want to show that your presence is having an impact, and that really strengthens the relationship and the resolve and the ability to collaborate and move forward towards even more ambitious projects. On some of the science side, these collaborations are obviously really, really important. No one person is an expert in all techniques. And so like the taxonomy study, for instance, relying on lab partners in Senckenberg in Germany for some of the movement ecology studies. We've developed this ambitious and groundbreaking continental scale study of giraffe movement. And so partnering with a number of different academic institutions, certainly the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute being sort of a marquee collaborator in this program, just to bring together diverse technical perspectives as well. Arthur mentioned the veterinary perspective. So bringing together, premier vets from across Africa to work together to make sure that what we're doing is bringing the best available technical skills, the best available knowledge, and putting it in the hands of the people who need it the most on the ground. And so really the core of that is developing these strong networks and these strong relationships.
Yeah, and one of the ideas that we kind of talk about a lot is how conservation, there's you can go top down, government, big agencies come and say, here's how you save giraffes. And then you have the lowest, whatever you want to call it, level, people coming up and say, hey, we're trying to save giraffes, and so somewhere meeting in the middle. And I obviously both can work, but I feel like nothing gets done without the local communities. So you kind of mentioned my pronunciation is going to be terrible, I'm sure, but the Twiga Wetu program. Do you mind unpacking either that program or just kind of some of your community-based programs in general, and just kind of share in the importance of getting the people on the ground that are there all the time involved in these kinds of initiatives?
Sure. Maybe let me start with the Twiga Wetu initiative. So this is a initiative where we usually start by working with community representatives, because in most cases you just can't show up and just say, oh, we're interested in saving giraffes. How do you go about it? You need to, obviously you need to see that there is that interest, and that there is importantly buy-in from the community to save giraffe. And we've been lucky that in some of these communities, actually, giraffes are perceived positively, if I can put it like that. They're not harmful, they're not destructive, and so people have that interest in protecting giraffes. And so one of the ways that we use to get the buy-in from people is to provide essentially field support, and also provide up-to-date information that people can use to then raise awareness on giraffe conservation initiatives. And so the Twiga Wetu initiative is essentially a way of getting local communities involved in doing field work, in essentially assessing where giraffes are, documenting mortalities, assessing threat levels, because these are simply the data that we do not have to then share with other stakeholders to make management decisions. And so how this helps to sort of feed into either the bottom-up approach or starting with the field people, we have maybe I can say Kenya at least, and also I'm pretty sure this also happens in Uganda. There are some countries that have built in what they call range committee meetings within their national strategies. So what these meetings do, they bring together government representatives and also maybe private researchers or community representatives to stakeholder meetings where these issues are discussed and then agreed upon by all these different stakeholders that have different views and maybe different priorities. And so they all agree on which conservation actions should be prioritized. And then we as GCF, we come in and we either seek support, we seek equipment support, or we provide technical support to get these conservation actions implemented. Because we've then, we've sort of in a way facilitated all these people to come together and agree that this is what's needed to save giraffes. So it's not necessarily our ideas, but these are ideas that are agreed upon by different stakeholders and people who have different experiences, who then say, yes, in my area, this is happening, and I need the government to recognize that this is happening. And then the government representative also comes in and say, oh, yeah, I'm aware that this is happening, or maybe I wasn't aware that this is happening, but now that you've brought it to my attention, maybe these other people can help. And, we all have everybody chiming in, and we see what approaches have worked where, because within our network, we are bringing in experience from other countries that we can share with different people, in different communities, and that helps. I've had an experience where someone in northern Kenya came and, vented out his frustrations about the lack of fuel, the lack of, equipment support. He didn't even know that there was a Kenya national strategy. And he just took that document and took it to the county government to look for financial support to, then get the county government involved. And that is something that gets us excited, because we show that such meetings and these documents are really useful and powerful tools for getting people involved in conservation.
Yeah, that's such an important point to acknowledge, is that these strategies and these projects are not imposed. It's a constant feedback. It's a dialogue, and Arthur described really well some of the processes that they go through, from sort of a higher level national conservation strategy, and just this constant interaction with stakeholders and this feedback to make sure that all of these different sources of knowledge, all these different perspectives are brought to bear on some of these conservation initiatives, and that it's not exclusively an outsider perspective, and that this feedback and this dialogue leading to effective conservation strategy.
I read, I think on your guys' website, there is thought to be about 120,000 giraffe left in Africa, roughly. Yep. But how did that happen? Like, what are the main stressors? Is it habitat loss? Is it, weird predation? And it may be there's 35 different things. So I guess, Michael, if you want to kind of just jump into that.
Yeah, so kind of one of the standard ubiquitous threats, not just for giraffe, but for a lot of wildlife in Africa and indeed throughout the world, is habitat loss and fragmentation, right? And that's unavoidable in a lot of these landscapes, as you see increased development and increased pressure for some of the resources in these landscapes. There's ultimately less space, less resources for giraffe in those same landscapes. And so trying to understand the ecological requirements for these giraffe, trying to understand how people are using the landscapes and how people are interacting with these giraffe is really at the foundation of how we try to envision coexistence in these different landscapes. And this is sort of a trickier threat in that it's hard to pinpoint. There's no villain. It's just sort of a natural byproduct of development. And different people have different land uses and different needs for different resources. But giraffe are also living on these landscapes too. So figuring out key resources for giraffe and how to utilize these landscapes is something that's really important for defining pathways to coexistence. And one of the key studies we have for developing those understandings is what we've called the Twiga Tracker Initiative. And so we've developed this continental scale giraffe tracking study. We've affixed GPS units to giraffe. We have over 230 giraffe tracked across over 9 different countries now, all 4 species on these key landscapes. And so using this GPS technology, using remote sensing and satellite imagery, we can hone in on key giraffe habitat features and linkages between these features so that we can identify and define corridors to protect and habitat features that are especially critical for giraffe, and maybe figure out ways to conserve those key areas and those key corridors in these increasingly developed landscapes.
There's so many different ways I could go because you guys do so much. Look at your website. I was like, all right, we're not going to talk about all of this. We're going to talk about maybe 10% of what you guys actually do. But, just try to touch on the highlights. But okay, so habitat loss and habitat fragmentation are the initiatives that GCF puts forward. Are those to kind of curtail habitat loss and fragmentation, or are there actual restoration projects going in place? Is this the community projects we're talking about, hey, try to let's all appreciate giraffes and stop destroying their habitat, or are there actual on the ground, hey, let's restore this habitat?
Trying to identify where giraffe historically are. This is another interesting element in conservation, is understanding historical baselines and understanding the dynamic nature of some of these ecosystems in which we're working. And so we can look at sort of giraffe distribution and abundance over the span of 3 decades or so. But that's really only a very brief snapshot of the greater picture of giraffe evolution and giraffe distribution and abundance. And so we can try to track this back as far back as we have records, but it gets a little bit muddier. But trying to understand where giraffe were, where giraffe can be, where giraffe are, and where they should be, which is an inherently value-laden distinction. But one of the ways of maybe going about this is something that Arthur had mentioned in the Niger case, some of the translocations to reestablish giraffe populations in areas that historically held them. So we can use Uganda as an example there. So starting off with some key ecological studies, we went into Uganda and we essentially created a database of all the giraffe in Uganda. So giraffe have unique spot patterns, and you can tell them apart as individuals as easily as like reading a name tag or a barcode. And so or we can go into these key populations and essentially track every single individual in the country. And so if we do that over a period of time, we can look at population trajectory rates in these key populations. And so when we started working in Uganda back in 2013, there were two key populations of giraffe, one in Murchison Falls National Park and one in Kidepo Valley National Park. And both of these populations had really incredible histories as well. So back in the late 1980s, Murchison Falls National Park giraffe population was less than 100 individuals. And since then, conservation initiatives and the cessation of political conflict has led to this increase where there's now 1,500 from less than 100 individuals. Kidepo Valley National Park saw a very similar increase where in the mid-1990s, there were thought to be maybe 3 giraffe remaining in a population that was once one of Uganda's largest populations. And we've charted this increase in giraffe population there. So now we suspect there's somewhere north of 70 giraffe. And so using this knowledge of these population trajectories, taking this back to a stakeholder engagement meeting, and where we brought in different representatives from all over the country, different perspectives, different key stakeholders, developed this national conservation strategy that Arthur mentioned. And one of the key outcomes of this strategy was to try to reestablish populations in areas where we knew there were giraffe in the past, but for political unrest and illegal hunting, they were extirpated from those regions. So when we started our work in Uganda in 2013, there were 2 populations. Now, through key partnerships with the Uganda Wildlife Authority and some science-driven conservation translocations, there's populations in 3 new places in Uganda. So there's 5 key populations, all of which are either stable or growing. This is all rooted in conservation science, stakeholder engagement, strategic collaborations and planning, and bringing in experts from across the world to make sure that we can successfully pull off some of these conservation initiatives, these pretty ambitious habitat conservations.
And to just add on to the examples that Michael was giving, it's really important to just see how everything is linked. So some of the rewilding or maybe the reintroduction projects that took place only happened after the government committed to restoring habitats in some of these areas. So some of these areas maybe were either degraded or maybe had been just rendered unsuitable for giraffe. But then once stakeholders agreed that reintroduction of giraffe in these areas where they historically were found is a key conservation action for giraffe survival, then the government commits to taking it up and restoring the habitat, or maybe ensuring that the habitat is secure and protected from poachers. And that has happened in Uganda, to have all these different populations that have now been reintroduced from the Murchison Falls population. And all of this is work that is agreed upon by different stakeholders. We always have several meetings with the Uganda Wildlife Authority and also the different stakeholders that come in and work with together to make this possible. So it is really a bit of everything to make conservation work.
So we know that when we bring giraffe back to these landscapes where they exist, there's these incredible ecological relationships. But one of the cool things that we've seen is sort of the cultural significance in giraffe and some of the communities around there. So again, if we use Uganda as an example, one of the places that we recently translocated giraffe, reintroduced them, is this place called Pianupe Wildlife Reserve. And this is an area that held giraffe. It was one of Uganda's largest populations up until 1996, which is relatively recent. So there's people there now who remember seeing giraffe in those landscapes not too long ago. And giraffe in those areas for some of those communities held incredible significant cultural value, sort of a totem animal for some of these communities. So when giraffe were brought back in, the community actually put together, there were signs coins, welcoming giraffe back to the landscape. There was sort of a welcoming committee. There was a dance for these giraffe. And so in addition to all the incredible ecological interactions that giraffes having these mega browsers on this landscape can have for this community there, it's also incredibly valuable for the communities, for the cultural value, and then potentially economic value, as tourism revenue can also increase for having these incredibly charismatic animals on this landscape. So there's real value to the people in those areas for having these animals back in these landscapes as well. And that's one of the strong motivators and one of the really powerful incentives for us in working in these places, is seeing success stories like that.
I didn't even think about how, if you reestablish giraffe, how the people that have grown up for literally the beginning of the species having this other incredibly impressive and weird animal to look at, like how impactful that is for their culture. I don't even know if I have a question there, but if Arthur, if you have anything else to add, or even Michael, if you have something else to add as well.
People have never known a world without giraffe. We've evolved on the landscape as a species with giraffe since our beginnings. And so giraffe have incredible cultural value. You can go back to rock carvings and petroglyphs thousands of years old, and people have always been fascinated with these animals, and it's something core to our existence as a species. We've never known a world without giraffe, and so there's an incredible iconic status of these animals. I wanted to give another example of sort of the value of incorporating local communities throughout Africa. A lot of local folks actually don't get to experience some of these landscapes in which giraffe inhabit. Some of the conservation areas, the national parks, have fees and costs associated with them. And so oftentimes a lot of the people who live in communities adjacent to these protected areas don't necessarily have the opportunity to experience them in the same way that some of the international tourists might. So for instance, in one of these conservation translocations, we're taking giraffe, which is essentially a truck with an open top, and you can see their heads driving out. And so we're driving through these villages. And I remember one of the most heartwarming parts of this whole operation, at least for me, we're driving through this one town in northern Uganda, Gulu, slowly navigating these city streets. And there's a young girl on the side of the road, and she's waving at the giraffe. And as we slowly go by, she runs inside her house and she pulls out a giraffe toy and waves it at the giraffe as they go by. And so it was a very brief moment in being able to sort of show these animals or give these folks an opportunity to experience these animals. But there's other ways you can go about doing it. And that's one of the things that GCF does as well as these environmental education programs, and trying to engage with local students and local youth to provide an opportunity to see some of these animals in the wild. Because we can talk about giraffe all we want, and we can cite figures and we can show pretty pictures. But really, I think one of the most powerful incentives for conserving them and making you fall in love with them is to see them and experience them in the wild and be able to share space with these incredible animals. I mean, there's nothing like the first time you see a giraffe in the wild. It's truly a powerful and moving experience. And if we really want to engender an appreciation and fascination with the conservation of these animals, providing those opportunities, especially the people who live alongside them, is something that's really valuable.
Yeah, and to maybe build on Michael's first statement, I mean, it's really hard to imagine a world without giraffes. We tend to think of giraffes as, African icons, but they're really, global icons, because if you look at just the number of institutions, of zoos, or maybe, vendors that use giraffe to market their products, it's really astounding. And there's actually a study that came out about 3 years ago, and that showed that giraffe are actually considered among the, top 10 charismatic species globally. If you look at animals that are used to market products that are considered charismatic, that are used in movies, described, in today's world, giraffe are loved globally. And the sad thing with that is that, even though they're among these top 10 most charismatic animals, they are also probably, among the least studied species that are considered charismatic. And so that's what we are also trying to do by bringing all these people together, and also by just driving, by, taking the lead on some of these things, is to show people that, the animals that people live with here in Africa that maybe, that they think that nobody is trying to do something about. These are animals that are loved globally, and that we are trying to, bring people together to try and, bring resources and, bring more attention to protecting, giraffes wherever they are. And so for us, that's a major driving force. And, we definitely want to be, successful in, making sure that these partnerships work for the benefit of giraffes and also for the benefit of the people that live with these different populations.
Yeah, again, that's so interesting to me because, when we, started setting this up, I was like, all right, giraffes are cool. I like giraffes, everyone likes giraffes. But then, just having this conversation, I'm realizing that giraffes are in our DNA because, as a species, we all came from this one area, and giraffes are very nearby. So they've been in our psyche, I guess, for such a long time. And because I've always wondered, what is it that makes me, why are you so interested in giraffes? It's like, well, is it just because they're tall? Is it because they look cool? It's like, well, it's probably that, obviously. But there's also probably an aspect of it that it's ingrained into our minds to respect them, to love them, to whatever the word you want to use. And I just find that so interesting because I remember reading somewhere that the great apes, they're all afraid of the same things. I remember them watching some video where they shook a hose and made it look like a snake, and all the apes just ran away. And people most people, I should say, are kind of inherently afraid of snakes, and they kind of connect those two, and that's heights and the dark or something that we're all kind of inherently afraid of. And just thinking of that same mindset of how we are, we all kind of love giraffes, and it's got to be at least partly that,
There was a very a powerful moment in visiting some of these rock carvings. For instance, there's some in Twyfelfontein in Namibia, where you go up to these rocks that were carved thousands of years ago, and it's very clear that these folks had a fascination with giraffe, and that this fascination with giraffe connects me and sort of my contemporaries with these people who were in the same landscape thousands of years ago, sort of bound across time by this fascination for this incredibly unique animal and these beautiful systems in which they inhabit. It's a cool unifying love, and figuring out ways to harness that and to translate that into action, at least now, to help conserve them is something that we're working on doing.
People in our field, they especially in the education side, they talk about connecting with nature, and I've never really known what that meant. It's kind of hard to define. I go for hikes or mountain bike riding, a pretty view, I feel good, I'm outside, but that's the best example I can think of, at least right now, is that where you see like you said, a cave drawing, a rock drawing, connected you to someone, and that's a true connection with nature, where you're that's basically all conservation, where you're coming up with names for plants that using Latin, and it's just this weird complex system that we have to set everything up to where it makes sense to us, but ultimately you're still having that same visceral connection with another species that our species has for thousands of years, and that's just so cool.
And who wouldn't love giraffes? If you look at them, they're weird looking animal, but in a good way. With the long neck and long legs, with this weird shape and interesting patterns. That is also so beautiful. Many people love their eyelashes. I don't know for what reason, but still, really, really beautiful. And with the dark purplish tongue, there's just quite a lot to love about giraffe, especially when you see them up close in the wild. Whatever they do just looks a bit off, like this isn't normal, but in a good way. It's just really interesting that it pulls you in. Like if you look at the graceful walk of giraffe, if you look at their running and the neck swaying, it's just something that pulls you in when it comes to giraffe. Even just their silhouette, if you're looking at them from afar, they're really, really interesting and beautiful animals that they just have a way of pulling you in and connecting with nature. Because for the most part, there are those animals that you look at and they don't have a menacing feature, and giraffes have that, for me at least. And so that is something that, helps me to connect with them.
Yeah, and Taylor and I, we joke a lot about how ultimately when it comes down to it, we're still 5-year-olds, and
Yeah.
we still love to like connect with. And for me, like I did my graduate studies in raptors because it's just for me anything that can just drop out of the sky and kill something with its face is just so cool. But you said something that I know I caught Austin being in wonder and awe when you said it, and it hit me the same way when you said people have never known a world without a giraffe. I think that opens up the question or the idea about biodiversity conservation in general. We don't know a world without a clouded leopard. We don't know a world without the vaquita. And it opens up these questions of, why are we working on this? And it's not to get too philosophical and not to get too maybe even metaphysical, but it's that capacity of our world becomes infinitely less rich if we don't work on these things.
Trying to figure out why we do the things we do, if it's an act of selfishness or selflessness, is something that I sometimes reflect on in conservation. What are the motivations and why are we doing these things? And ultimately, what I've come down to, at least for my the way I personally sort of reconcile these ideas, is conservation is an inherently value-laden field, and we're trying to work to preserve the systems that we value. And different people value different systems for different reasons. And so our job as conservationists is to try to identify those values and act upon them. So I had to reflect early on, at least in my career, onto what conservation actually meant for me, and coming up with an operational definition for conservation, because it is such a nebulous term and it is so inherently value laden. And so the definition I came with is the translation of values across key stakeholders to enact meaningful positive change on key ecological touch points. And so you have the social component, you have the ecological component, and you have the value component. And ultimately, what we're deciding as peoples, as sort of the holders of power in this ecological relationship, at least as we may vainly consider ourselves to be, is what we want to conserve and why we want to conserve it. And those, science can't necessarily tell you those answers. Science can help guide solutions, but that's on us to determine the values that we want to conserve and represent in the future.
I like that. And, I'd like to build on that, using the example of the Nubian giraffe found in Kenya and Uganda. And, it makes for good banter, especially if you consider, there are some less used names for the Nubian giraffe. So if you go to Uganda, they call it the Ugandan giraffe. They have that connection and link to it. And they want to conserve it because it's their, it's a national pride for them. We always argue about percentages. They said, oh, they have, 80% of the world's, Nubian giraffe, Ugandan giraffe. So they claim it, and they have, it's in their, values to protect this animal. And that's really good to see. You come to the Kenyan side, yes, it's the Nubian giraffe. They also want to call it, the Baringo giraffe, because that's the historical range in Kenya, and they want to create that link of having this population to that specific area in Kenya. And so it is important to recognize these values and just have, build that connection. And that becomes even more pronounced when you go to Tanzania, where giraffe are the national animal. And there is, even much bigger pride there in conserving, giraffe, just making sure that they can't have a world, they can't have Tanzania without giraffe. I think if that ever happens, there will be, heads will roll. So it's, but hopefully not literally, but, that's something that, people have this link that when they think of, giraffe, or when they think of wildlife, there's definitely something that connects them to certain realities. And, it's good to see all this happening for sure.
Everything that you're saying, it's a very, very value-laden field. It has more than just the utilitarian component of, hey, it's a mega browser, so everyone benefits. Great, and I love your definition as well, Michael. It gets me to one of my thoughts that I've had is that
we get to do this work. We get to, as conservationists, save giraffes or, whatever species. And I think there's something very important in that as humankind, we get to do this work, which is, you get to wake up every day and I get to work on giraffes. That's a very special thing. I don't think I had a question. I think I was just fanboying out.
It's an incredibly privileged position. It certainly is. And that privilege comes, with a host of responsibilities. We get to work with these animals. We get to work with the communities alongside them, and making sure that we figure out ways to incorporate all of these values and try our best to understand and develop equitable solutions is a responsibility we take really, really seriously. We mentioned it from our perspective, but there's also the giraffe's perspective as well. And sort of and that's a commonly used conservation argument as well, sort of this inherent right to existence for giraffe. And that's something we also want to acknowledge as well.
We are lucky, actually, Michael and I, because we are working with a species that, compared to other charismatic species, there's still a lot to learn about giraffe. If you look at lion, elephant, they've been studied for, continuously, I'd say, for more than 60, 70 years, where you've had these long-term studies that have generated a lot of data on these animals. And so we know quite a lot about them. But when it comes to giraffe, we still have a long way to go. And, as scientists, that just keeps our brains turning, like, what can we look at? What can we reasonably do with the resources that we have? Because, when I started my job, one of the first questions that we had to dig into was, how many giraffe in Kenya are there and where are they? Yes, there was some data available at the time, but with our resources, we could enrich those data and we could work with the governments to better protect them. And if you think about it, so for me, this was in 2016. And if you think compared to other animals, that's we are starting late, but it also gives us better tools in terms of science and technology to better answer these questions. And so for me, that's always gets us excited because, there's a lot to learn. And so we definitely have a lot of work to do.
We're calling this series the Possibilists. We base it off of the Michael Soule quote with, to sum it up, it says, if someone asks if I'm optimistic or pessimistic, I say I'm possibilistic. It's kind of a nebulous thing that we're trying to explore by doing this. And so I guess when it comes to your experiences, your work, giraffes in general, and you kind of already mentioned a little bit about how there is a way forward, but what does that concept mean to you? And that could be from, the initiatives that you guys have put into place or, bigger picture ideas about the future of the conservation of these species.
So what that means to us is, we want to be at the forefront of, using science to help protect these, to help protect giraffes. We always, because we are, we have a big footprint, we also, we try to accommodate as many, possible ideas that we can use to help inform giraffe conservation. This is something that's important to us in that we recognize that there's a lot of work to be done. And so we need to, think creatively about implementing some of these solutions simply because, we can't give up, that's not an option. So we definitely, reach out and branch out and try to find the right partners, to look at, what are the possibilities? What can we do? And a cool example that I can give is, as GCF, we've been at the forefront of, using satellite technology of tracking, where giraffes are, where they go, and just determining home range. Because, if we are to save giraffe, if you are thinking long-term, just understanding, space use is something that is really, really key. If you look at the, human population trends, if you look at how the, landscapes are becoming more and more fragmented, we work with different partners to look at what are the solutions, on the satellite technology tracking side that we can use to identify these core ranges, to identify what are, hotspots for poaching, that type of thing. And, there are just so many possibilities. And so it's up to us to then, be the driving force for that. And it's up to us to try and, just keep going. I think that's the best way I can put it. It's still a lot of work to do, and there are way forwards. We have to, think creatively about how to implement those.
We're also at a very unique moment in giraffe conservation. And I know a theme of this podcast is optimism, but that's a real possibility for giraffe now. It's not a narrative in which these animals are too far gone or they're beyond saving. There are real actionable solutions that we can use science and local collaborations to implement. And we're doing that now. And we're seeing some incredible growth in populations in some of these landscapes, and both, the number of populations across these landscapes and the abundance within each of these populations. So there are ways forward, and there's a reason to be hopeful. And we're at a very unique moment where if we act now, we can have some really positive changes on some of these key populations to make sure that this charismatic animal is available and valuable, and whatever that means to you or to them in these landscapes for generations to come.
Arthur and Michael, thank you so much for joining us and talking about the GCF and all the work you guys have done. It's truly impressive what you guys have been able to accomplish and the direction you guys are headed as an organization and individually. It's inspiring, and we're so thankful that you guys are doing what you're doing. If you guys don't mind, share where our listeners and everyone can find GCF online, social media, or however you guys want to connect with people.
Sure. Thanks, Austin. Well, you can find Giraffe Conservation Foundation on www.giraffeconservation.org. That's our website where you can find lots and lots of information on giraffe, lots of our reports on the fieldwork that we do, beautiful giraffe photos, and also giraffe merch. So go ahead, check out our website. It's really interesting. We have also the Giraffe Resource Center, where if you are interested in giraffe literature, just want to see what's been published on giraffe, look up Giraffe Resource Center, and you can just learn more about giraffe and see what we are doing. We also have a Facebook page, Giraffe Conservation Foundation, where we share all the updates, tidbits, opportunities on, volunteering. Well, maybe post-COVID, but for now, before we used to share opportunities there. Every Friday, we post really cool, beautiful photos of giraffe. You can also share your photos there. Maybe we can share it on every Friday. We have our Instagram page at Giraffe Conservation. We have our Twitter page at @save_giraffe. I don't know what else I'm forgetting, but yeah, just look up Giraffe Conservation Foundation and you'll find lots of those pages. If you have any questions from this, you can email me, at arthur@giraffeconservation.org. Happy to answer any questions relating to giraffe conservation in East Africa. Happy to answer those. And I'm also on Instagram, even though right now it's still a private page, but usually answer any questions there as well on Arthur Muneza. Thank you.
Well, awesome. Thank you guys again so much. This was so much fun. And good luck with everything in the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure chatting with both of you guys as well. It's really fun to reflect on these and converse and explore these ideas with other folks as well. And so thanks for this opportunity.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much for listening. I wanted to say thank you again to Arthur and Michael and the Giraffe Conservation Foundation as a whole for taking the time to talk with us. The work they do to protect and conserve giraffes in Africa is amazing and truly inspiring. Please check out their website and social media pages to further interact with GCF and see how you can get involved. Hosts and producers for this episode are Austin and Taylor Parker. Producers are Kat Coots and Andrea Santi from the Smithsonian Institute's Earth Optimism Initiative. Music was provided by A Picture Book Studios. Please like, comment, and subscribe to our page if you haven't already, and thank you again for tuning in. We'll talk to you next time.